evening, and so great to have you join us as we continue with our hot topics conversation around my church or your church. And so as we continue with this conversation, this week we're going to be looking at an exciting topic which comes from Martin Luther King's statement made many years ago. I think it was 1970, when he said, "Church hour is the most segregated hour of the week." And this basically comes from the fact that when you look at how church happens, we all decide to go to our preferred spaces. And this is not only us being divided across racial lines, but it's also us being divided across cultural preferences. And so as we continue to explore this topic, we've got in studio with us today Kamza Munwametsi, who's a minister at Bryanston Methodist and also a former minister at Rosebank Methodist, both very diverse congregations, so we look forward to his input. But we also have Lauren, who is a former youth pastor at Trinity Methodist. And myself and Ilse, who will be the co-host for today, will be engaging them to hear what they have to say about this particular topic. But before we go on, I just want to hand over to you guys to introduce yourself, and we'll kick it out from there.
So yes, as Hloni said, I was a youth pastor at Trinity Methodist Church for 4 years. Having grown up in a Methodist church, you know, I felt like I was really sheltered. And working at a church, I really got to see the bigger, broader meanings of what a church really is. So that was really an eye-opener. Since then, I have left to start a mission non-profit, which hopefully after COVID settles down will be taking off again.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for hosting me today. As Hloni have said, that I am currently at Bryanston Methodist Church, but before that I was at Rosebank. He forgot to mention that one other station that has given me a different cultural flavor, again on my ministry, was at Rosebank and in Utenake, where I was stationed in a predominantly colored congregation. So I had to learn Afrikaans, I have to speak Afrikaans, but also at the same time there were few Xhosa-speaking people who happened to be part of that congregation. And subsequent to that, I was sent to Bathurst and Port Alfred, which is also a geographic circuit. So I was the only black minister ministering to a congregation there, of a white congregation, the age average of about 60 to 90. So I had to stand in front of the congregation every morning, and I look around and say, "Hey, where are my people here? I'm the only one." And so that has given me a different type of understanding different cultures. And yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to the engagement.
Awesome. As we kick it off, I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that as far as the conversation around integration, when we reflect on it in our modern society, it is not only a racial issue, but it's also an issue around subculture. You know, there are people who would go to a particular song because of the music, and it is also an issue around age. You look at our services. You know, I know that there are churches. I think, Kamza, you come from a church like that. Maybe Lauren, you guys can tell us. But I know even Ilse and I came. We've also been at the same congregation before. And there is a sense in which most of our traditional services would, one, be divided across. First service would be for the third age. That is your elderly folks. That is your early morning service. You know, that's where everyone is. And then the second service is a family service, because now we're all looking for something that can cater again for a particular niche, which is our children. You know, and you'd find that churches with the strongest youth ministries would have a bigger family service. And then your third service would be a young adult service. And even in that sense, we are not integrated. We've got these age-specific congregations.
And I think it's sometimes not just the age thing, it's even interest-based. So you take some churches like those biker churches, where it is a church that is formed around an interest, and the way that they would worship is completely different. You've got your congregations that are a bit more youthful, like you've mentioned, and then you've got your very traditional churches who still like to sing their hymns and have their communion every week, and those types. And that's just kind of how our subcultures and even interests reflect in our style of worship.
And I suppose then the challenge that we really want to engage today and just throw it out to you today is it really worth it to lose the idea of integrated services over us cherry picking a service according to our interests and what we prefer?
Well, look, of course, we're using the word integrated services. And one can ask a question, integration versus inclusivity. Because at the same time, being integrated does not necessarily suggest that we are inclusive. So you would have, for an example, traditional churches where people who come from different cultures are part of that. So let me pick up on one of my congregations and say, let's look at Bryanston. So you've got the 7 o'clock traditional service. You do have a couple of black people who come from different cultures. Others are Xhosas, Tswanas, and as far as Limpopo and vendors and so on. And so they are part of that service. It's a traditional service. The way it is run, the way it is conducted, the elements of the liturgy are traditional in nature. However, it is not inclusive. It remains to be exclusive, you know. And so, yes, it is an integrated space, but it can still remain an exclusive space, despite the form of service that it has.
Well, what's very interesting for me is coming from a church that we had 5 services on a Sunday, and that excludes your children's church and your teen church. So we would have our 7:30 service in the morning, which was a traditional service, communion every Sunday, an organ player, and predominantly, I'd like to say 60, but probably 70 plus. And, you know, so you ask some of the youth to go to that service, and they would go, but they're going to think of me in a certain way. I'm going to feel so judged. You know, I don't know what I can and can't do. Do I have to dress up? Do I, you know, because how would they react in front of their grandparents? That's what they've got to do at church. And then for them, is it really church, or is it a compulsory, you will sit down here, you will act a certain way? We then had a very controversial topic of having 2 services running on the property at the same time at our 9:30 slot. So the one was more traditional. There was a choir and the organ pipes, and very much probably more like a sandwich setup to your worship service. So it was very based on liturgy, and it would be song, prayer, song, message, and it was very broken up. So when someone who just wants to go and sing and worship God for like half an hour arrives, they get frustrated being told, sit, stand, sit, stand. And so for them, that might be an issue. Whereas at the same time, maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, just because of the nature of having kids, in our chapel, a service was happening where, you know, much more relaxed start. We're not starting at 9. We'll wait until all the parents are back from dropping their kids off. So 9, 9:15, it'll start. And then very much so, there's a kids' corner in the venue. And so for me, as much as I love the idea, I hated attending that because I have the attention span of like a goldfish. And so, you know, here I am in church, and then the tower of bricks falls over, and I'm looking as to, you know, what's going on, or is there a fight about to break up? And so for me, I found that service very difficult. But I know parents who were so grateful for that service because it would save them having to run out to children's church every 5 minutes to make sure that their kid's okay. So that was our morning services. Then we had a vernacular service, which at some stage would go on for 3 hours. And, you know, that's a large chunk of your Sunday. But, you know, and it was so interesting because it wasn't in one language. So it was predominantly Zulu. And then, you know, if we had people from elsewhere, someone would come and translate. And I think that's why it took 3 hours, is because you had the same sermon, you know, said 3 times in a different language. Obviously, from a traditional, even the way they would enter the church, from the dress code being in different organizations and movements, the music style was different. There were whistles and bells and I don't know what you call those, klapper things. The beaters, yeah, those ones. And so, you know, for me, I loved attending those services. I had no idea what was going on for most of the time. But for me, I had special moments in that, where a congregation member, you know, would give me their hymn book to sing along, or when the church started putting translations, so I could sing, but I could understand what I was singing. And so for me, I found that a very special time. Then we had our evening service, which was aimed at our youth and young adults, of probably more of a middle class congregation. And it was been so interesting to watch, because a lot of that congregation has been infiltrated, that sounds horrible, but I'm going to use the word, by almost a lower class. So a lot of the guys that are attending our soup kitchen, we've got a lady who works at the bakery at the Pick and Pay around the corner, who has found home in that congregation. And so, yeah, being at that church for so long, I've seen, the behind the scenes. How have they made that decision? How, and having 5 different services. We have an annual birthday party service where we try and put everyone in one. And the first one was a lot of work. But as we've done them more and more often, more and more congregation members are saying, oh, we loved that. But they wouldn't want to do it every week. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that's interesting, is that they're not opposed to doing it, but they still want time where church is theirs.
It's an interesting thing that both of you present. Listening to you, I was thinking about this idea of need, how we cater towards a specific need. And then, Lauren, you said the last service, and you just busted my bubble. I was building this theory about how it's the specific need, and then when you spoke about how some people have, for the lack of a better term, infiltrated that service, and I thought, but if it's catered towards youth specifically, what is it about that service? But I wonder if it doesn't actually boil down to a need. For some people, the need in the service is to be seen and to be part of something. That would maybe be your more traditional services, where you've got your organizations you want to be part of that organization and worship within your organization, within your group. And for others, generally in like your evening services, it's the one to almost not be seen. And to be able to come in, explore, question, and not to feel like you're stuck in that space. Mm. And then if you do like it, maybe you like that style of worship and come into that. What are your thoughts around that? Do you think that it's a possibility of that we have to carry on having these exclusive services to enable people's needs being met? Or is there a way to meet the needs while having integrated and inclusive services?
Well, if you think of the black traditional service, and you're referring to it as a vernacular service, and in other spaces they would say 12 o'clock service and 11 o'clock service, Siyakudumisa service, and you say it's 3 hour long. It can be longer than that at times. If you think of that, you do not have a specific category that you can use for it. So it's just a service. So you don't have a family service. In most of the churches in our black African communities, you won't have a family service, you won't have a youth service. It's just one service. So everybody goes there to worship. Now that's when we can say, does that service really cater for different needs of different people in that space? And my answer would be no. For the simple reason that, let's pick up on young people. So you get there, you are partly enculturated. Right? So you are forced to succumb to a particular culture of that service. And you are forced to sing Siyakudumisa, whether you like it or not. It's not an issue. It's there. You have to do it. You are forced to sing songs in a very traditional way, even if you would want to express yourself in a more contemporary manner. Young people would be sitting there. They want to beat their drums, blow their whistles. In some instances, they will be stopped. You're making noise. You're not supposed to do that. So they kind of like find themselves being confined and lacking a space where they can express themselves authentically, and live out their spirituality. And the same with other people there. They might not want to be in that service for 2 hours. They might prefer to be there 1.5 hours, an hour. But because that's how the service is structured, it does not cater for their needs. So that's what I think.
I think having spent some time in smaller congregations in Mozambique, in rural villages, from the first time I went to this village where it was a very much African church, and not really sure what the denomination was, but church was happening, and it was special. And the more and more we visited this village, the Methodist Church of Southern Africa appointed a minister, and it's been so amazing to watch a church grow from scratch. Where, they're at a point now where Sunday school happens just before church starts, and it's a village. So the children know that they go, the Sunday school teachers are waiting for them, they have a little lesson, but then they stay in the service for the church. And those children are the most well-behaved children you have ever seen. And there's no crying, there's no punching, it's great. But what I find so interesting is that it's very much around community. And so, you stand up and, as we would in a service, share the notices. But all of a sudden, the notices aren't so much about events happening, but it's about what's going on in each one of your lives. And if they've got a guest speaker, you're doing the sermon, whether you've planned one or not. So now I know to go planned. But, that there's such a difference in Mozambique. That village is only 12 hours away. It's not far. They don't want a building around them. So it is grass around us, and it's under a tree, and that's it. And then if I look at what you were saying about the integration, and I think, Ilse, you mentioned about the need. I've been church hopping for a while. I think, having worked at a church, you want to sort of turn off the work and just be fed. But I found that I was quite picky in what I needed in a church. And so someone who, knows that church is not about me, it's about God. I remember driving past one church, and I was a little bit late, but they locked their doors because of collection time. For me, that was such a turn off, and I'm going, I will never go to that church again, because for me, a church needs to be a place that is open and welcoming. And I understand that maybe it was a security risk, but it can be something like that I value community. And so for me, I need church to be a place where community is important.
It's, what you've actually mentioned, just around how we cherry pick, based on our need. I just one book that I was reading where Dietrich Bonhoeffer speaks about this thing where church is not a place where you cherry pick people into your community. We belong to one another through grace and not through our preferences. Like, I prefer Ilse, therefore I will belong with Ilse. And people go on, when analyzing that, to say there is something we are missing out on because of these segregated spaces. One, Barna Group suggests that a lot of young people who end up leaving the church leave the church because of shallow diversity, where it's just them in their own space. They're looking for something that is real, that's going to teach them how to engage real life issues. They want to engage diversity. They want to engage people of different ages, so that when they go to the workspace, they've been equipped to do life at a much deeper level with people who are older than them. And then they go on to speak around, and then there's an author by the name of Kendra Christine who suggests that if young people spend too much time in exclusive spaces, at some point when they outgrow those exclusive spaces, that youth church, and that's all they've ever been exposed to, by the time they're meant to be integrated into the greater community, they do not know how to belong to that community. And I then want to suggest that what if through these exclusive spaces we are actually robbing South Africa from a milking pot that can teach people how to belong to one another, people of different ages, people of different races, people of different class. You go on. What if through creating these exclusive spaces, we are robbing South Africa of a milking pot, and all we needed to do in order to establish the space is give up our preference?
So that's very interesting, because what I found, especially working with youth and young adults, is that if I were to take them now and throw them into a place that's completely exclusive, there would be a lot of rejection, a lot of walls being put up, because they don't know how. However, if I take the same group of youth or young adults and I get them to a place where they're confident in who they are, they're confident in their relationship with God, and equip them, they would manage that transition much better. Because I think because of how we've been so exclusive for so long, this is all we know. And how can, you put me out there and it's a sink or swim. As it is, I think a lot of it comes down to participation, because you can have an inclusive service, but if I'm sitting there because the Zulu song is being sung and I don't know the words and I don't want to sing, is that actually being inclusive? Or am I just excluding everyone but in the same room? So, I don't know.
Yeah, look, when you think of a worshiping space, first and foremost, one understands that it is a place where people are kind of like demonstrating their ontological expression of self, right? And so I bring myself to this space. Automatically, I am expected to, to share my cultural aspect, and that would be inclusive of language. And one of the key divisive factor in most of the worshiping spaces is language. And one cannot undermine the power of language as a tool that can either create exclusionary forms of belonging or becoming a tool that can be used for inclusion. And so you think of, I was at Rosebank Methodist Church. I can proudly say that it's one of the churches in this connection of the Methodist Church where they sing Setswana, Xhosa, and Zulu and English. And I'm talking about what you would call your vernacular services. And so being in that space, you realize that in as much as the message is proclaimed in English, but all the other languages are accommodated. So you get into that space, you are right in Cape Town, and you can sing Setswana. Right in Cape Town, you can sing Sesotho. It's a very rare thing to find, because they understand that culture and language is such an important tool that can unite people. At the same time, I don't think I would want to argue that point, Hloni, that is it possible for people to kind of like live their preferences as they enter worship space? I don't think that's possible, because we bring ourselves into these spaces. We bring our social understanding of our identity, we bring our cultures, we bring how we socialize. We don't leave that when we enter the space, when we enter the church. And hence in the church you'd find that despite you trying to propagate for unity, you'd always find people, grouping themselves according to how they socialize. Because you bring this to this worshiping space. So I don't want us to think that a worshiping space can be a space where we can say to people, when you enter that door, please leave certain things outside and come and be something else, allow the people to be who they are. And hence I believe that the concept of integration, it's quite a problematic one, because to a certain extent it does contribute in people even failing to understand and expressing themselves purely on who they are. And I can talk about myself. So let me use my ministry as an example. For the rest of my ministry, I've ministered in what you would call your geographic circuits, predominantly multicultural congregations. So I'm expected to speak to proclaim the gospel or to preach in English. Now, when I do what you would call your family service or your traditional service in the morning, when I preach there, I don't actually preach. Because in most of the white congregations, you don't have that dynamic, vibrant preacher, You have meditative, you need to be contemplative. So you sit there, you stand there. Jesus said, brothers and sisters in Christ. So you are genuine with the people in a more of being a teacher, and allowing them to immerse themselves in the scripture. So when I get to the 12 o'clock, you see a different Kamukhelo. I'm a different person because I'm in a different space. All right? What does that do to me? So psychologically, I am now being channeled to think that when I'm in certain spaces, I have to be somebody else, because I have to accommodate a particular group of people. When I'm in certain spaces, I can be authentic, can bring that dynamic me out. When I'm in the family service or the English-speaking service and I started just, raising my voice a bit and say, why are you making noise? Why are you shouting? Exactly. Why are you shouting? You know? But it is not understood the same way when you are in another space. So what can worship space do to people is that it can either build you and it can rob you of who you are. And I think that needs to be something that we explore as we're talking about integration. Are we talking integration of just people coming together, which is an automatic thing that happens? By virtue of us being different, we are coming to one space, then we are integrated. But does not mean when I'm there, I will be able to authentically express myself and express my faith and spirituality the way I would want to. Because then the worship service is being structured in another way. It will either rob me of my cultural identity or it can enhance my cultural identity.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on something that you said just a little bit earlier, was about how language has the power to either divide or include and all of that. I want to speak a little bit about language in the sense of like liturgical language, in the way that we worship. So each denomination or church has a specific liturgical language, and so would each service. You know, the language you would use or how you would structure the service. But how do we understand this then if we are now trying to integrate and include interdenominationally? So as a church, when the church started, like right in the beginning, just after Jesus, it was one church. You know, it was a group of people and then we start having all these factions, and we have the East and the West and then eventually we end up with over 3,000 different denominations nowadays. And then you have people saying, yes, but as a church, we are called to be united. But if we cannot even get it right in our own denomination, not even denomination, within our own societies, is there hope for us to be able to worship ecumenically? I can speak from my experience. So, Hloni and I have both pastored that congregation before, where you will find this geographical space. So it's within a gated community essentially, and within the same road there are 4 different churches directly next to each other. Directly. You've got an NG church, you've got a Familiekerk, you've got a Methodist church, and you've got a bit more Pentecostal charismatic church. And during the week, you have these people, most of them are living in that area, and they go work together, they speak different languages, but yet they find a way to work together. Come Sunday morning, it is truly like, Martin Luther King said, it is the most segregated hour. So-and-so will go to their church, I will go to my church, and come sunrise service, somehow we find a way to worship together. Yeah. But after that sunrise service, you still want to go back to your church. Yes, it was an amazing experience to worship together, and somehow we made it work, but you still want to go back. Is there hope for us as a church to integrate and include people while taking into account the denominational and liturgical language, I suppose?
I think something very interesting, so from where I was in Trinity, we're part of the Linden Northcliffe Fraternal. And so the ministers in the area Linden, if you know Linden, it's like church capital. There's a church on every block. And what's been so interesting is the fraternal has been going for years now. And once a month, the ministers and sometimes the other pastoral staff, youth pastors, will get together and they'll have a lunch and they'll chat about what's going on in their community. And we have started outreach programs together. We are caring for the same homeless. So instead of just doing soup kitchen Monday at this church, Tuesday this church, Wednesday this church, that's still happening. But we've also created we've linked up with an outside organization, and we're feeding them. And so between the churches, we've employed a social worker to work with them to help get jobs, to help. So I think in one way, it is a start. It's not so much about services. We've had worship events, and we've had sunrise services, and we've even tried like a camp, like a Linden camp for the youth. And I think another amazing way is through, obviously you're speaking about youth, is schools ministry. Because you're going to a school where the kids are at their school, and one goes to the Catholic school, one goes to the Anglican, and because the schools aren't allowed to teach religion, you go there as an outsider and you say, look, it doesn't matter which church I'm at, but let's talk. And I think if we can get our youth doing that, as they move up, they'll say, you know what, let's go to your church this week. Or, you know, I'm doing a very cool series. I think it will touch what we're going through in life at the moment. But I do think that there always needs to be a place where you can feel home. So when you are maybe needing to be fed, when you're maybe needing to be cared for, it's like my parents have been away now for 2 weeks, and it's been horrible. There were things with our dogs, and I've spent a lot of time at the vets the last 2 weeks. But when my parents came home, there was just this like, you know, I can now breathe again. I can now take time to rest and relax and be fed, so I can get out to being the whole me that I'm used to. And I think in some way church is that. It's home. And so as much as it's great to be with everyone all the time, there's something about going home, sleeping, to go out again.
Look, you're asking an important question, is there hope for us? I think there is hope for us. However, that should not be pseudo-hope. You know, it should not be a false hope. It should be hope that is based on clear, genuine, honesty, sense of belonging into any community. And I'm saying that because a number of times in all the circles that I've been part of, one has tried to do this integrated services. So we call them the combined services, right? Combined services. So once in a while, we're going to be worshiping together because the Methodist Church says, no, but you are one. You are one and undivided church. And so you ought to be in one space and worship together. So we say, okay, fine. Combined service once a quarter. And then I will do that. But the question is, who is going to be determining the style of worship that will be happening there? That's the first thing. Who is going to be structuring the order of service? I come from the point of privilege that I'm a minister, so I will structure the service. And in all my reflections around those combined service, I realized that actually I have robbed my black people a sense of belonging in those services. Because number one, I would be there and I would be speaking in English. That's the first thing. And I have a lot of grannies and toppies here who are not, very acquainted or even familiar with English or comfortable with it. But the service will be structured in English. So I would have to secondly cut the liturgy because I want to accommodate all the groups, right? So I will cut the liturgy, or at least I will compromise and have Siagudumisa there. They will be happy if Siagudumisa is there. Yes. But I will cut out each and every other aspect or other elements of the liturgy. The second thing is going to be the issue of time. How long should the service be? Now, black people are very tolerating of time. White people are not, We can spend 3 hours there, and they would feel like, yeah, I come from church. Now, we had those services, combined services. The minute it says an hour is gone, you start seeing people picking up their bags, and what they do, they leave, And then what does that do to those who remain? Psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. What are the impact of that, seeing people picking up their bags and leaving you in a space where they're supposed to be worshiping with you? And so I believe that there's hope, but this hope for me comes from the premise of allow people to be comfortable in expressing their spirituality, their faith in their own way. There is nothing wrong with that. And that's what I proclaim. I think I'm outgrowing the stage in my spiritual journey where I need to force people in the name of integration, because it can be an integration that is not based on authenticity, and instead it causes more damage. So we can say, people, come, let us integrate. But what does this integration look like? Who determines this integration? Who calls the shot on this integration? Who's supposed to sacrifice and compromise their being when they enter that space of integration? Who?
Absolutely. Just before Hloni goes into the next bit for us, I think it's a little bit, if I can use that, and forgive me if this is maybe just taking it a bit too simple, but just to give a bit of a metaphor or an analogy maybe, it's like when we have, our club soccer. Everybody supports their specific club. You have your reasons for supporting that club. Sure. But the World Cup comes around, we're all going to back the national squad. We're all going to, but after that, we don't all suddenly decide we're going to be Sundowns fans or Chiefs fans. We go back to our, because that's home. That's where we identify with. And I think it's something important that you raise is you have to allow people to have, both of you raise, have their space where they're comfortable and where they feel like that is where I can freely and fully worship God.
And so maybe then just moving on from there, how then do we engage? So I remember chatting to one of the guys who was here on Hot Topics. They say church is a space where we are called out of the community so that we can speak into the community. Called out so that we can speak into the community. And one of my wrestles, I remember as a youth pastor used to be at Brackenhurst Methodist Church, which is a very old white suburb with changing demographics. But a lot of our black Methodists who resided in Brackenhurst would go to the nearest township, which was Thokoza, as opposed to worshiping at Brackenhurst. But the challenge came when you engage with some of the young people from those families, when you realize that the constant migration to Thokoza robs them of an opportunity to engage issues around race within their community. Because when we're at church and we're doing church together, when the integration is not the kind that silences the other, to say, you keep quiet, this is the culture here, but when we have real conversations, it equips them to engage racial issues at school. But when there's the constant migration on a Sunday, it takes that away from them. And we could say that this is also true in instances where we've created exclusive communities to the point that we've taught people to not sacrifice their interest. To the point that in Randburg, I think it's at Randburg, where there's a deaf community, there's a deaf church.
Yes, that's Randburg.
Because we are exclusive. As opposed to saying, sacrifice your preference, where you might be irritated by the idea of there being someone interpreting in sign language. You might be irritated by the idea of not having wooden pews because they're exclusive to people who use wheelchairs. So saying sacrifice your interest and your preference, whereas you might be irritated by the idea of having someone who's still wrestling with their sexuality in the community. As a result, we now have a gay church. Are we going to continue with exclusive spaces because we don't want to do the hard work?
I definitely think there's a difference between having exclusive spaces, for example, the homosexual church, and for the deaf. I did a project, I did a bit of research on how could we make our church available and give opportunity to the deaf community. And I think from an expense point of view, to have someone who is signing is huge. You know, now it's not just one signer for the sermon, because now what do you do during worship? How do you worship together? What's happening if that family has a child with a hearing difficulty? So you need someone at children's church. And I know it sounds silly to bring it to money, but resources is important when it comes to something so specific. And so perhaps it is easier to have a church where that is almost one of the aims of the church, is to have a place where people with hearing difficulties can feel a part. But I think it's very important in your geographical area to be doing things together, whether it's outreach, whether it's fellowship, whether it's doing a course together, that you make accommodations for.
Lauren,
I don't know.
I struggle with what you just said.
I know
I
you
genuinely
do.
I genuinely struggle with what you just said. You know, because I think we almost saying it's not a worthwhile investment. I doubt we do not have the resources. You know, so for instance, we tried in our old community to run a disability-friendly Sunday every year, where it's an opportunity for us as a congregation to really, on that week, inspect the facilities and all of that, and look at all of that. You know, But I don't know. I see we're really running out of time. But I struggle with us saying we do not have the resources, because I think as a denomination, if we could put in effort, it would not only be a burden to the society, but we'd make it a point that even our buildings and everything we do is somehow inclusive to different people.
So that is very interesting, because people are so unique and so different. So as soon as you're going, okay, well, we've got something for the deaf, we've got something for the visually impaired, we've got something for those in wheelchairs. What about those that, not that it's that frequent, but two people that are linked by the hips. Now we can't have individual chairs. Now we have to have a double chair for them. And so all of a sudden, if you're taking each person as an individual who walks through that door, you almost have to say, please fill out all your preferences, all your life stories, so that we can make this church about you. And I think I struggle with that, because church shouldn't be about me as an individual. It should be unity in a community. So if you come to church and you're in a wheelchair and you go, this church has pews, hopefully someone in the congregation, and I think this is important, congregation, not staff, sees that as an opportunity to befriend someone and to partner with them and to disciple each other. And I think it comes back to that relationship. So, if there's someone who is deaf and comes in, say, well, can I sit with you afterwards to make sure that you understood everything? And I think for me, that's where the unity and community comes in. It's in the people interacting, not necessarily what the church is providing. The church is the community. It is the people. And I think that's where it has to start, with each of us as individuals.
Look, Hloni, I think you are right, and I partly agree with you that we need to work hard to ensure that ultimately we build a community that is inclusive, the community where people can feel belonging and not fitting in. All right? So I think that's the difference for me. The difficulty is that most of our churches are structured and built in such a way that people want to fit in, Hence you find them opting to withdraw and go and create their own communities where they can belong. Because for example, we pick on the LGBTQI community, being part of most of our traditional conservative churches, they find it difficult to belong, because of the deep entrenched sense of exclusionary ways that we do church. And so people opt to go and belong somewhere else. And however, our Wesleyan theology calls upon us that it is inherent in our beliefs and our doctrines that we are a community of acknowledging and recognizing that everybody has been created in the image of God. And so that's the essence of who we are. And therefore, in everything that we do, we ought to be coming from the premise where we say everybody can belong here. But the truth of the matter is not the case. And that's what we need to work towards. That's the ideal, And the question is, if that does not happen, what do we do with people who are struggling to belong in these communities? I think that's the hard work that we need to be doing. And so our liturgical material needs to be structured in such a way that it is inclusive. All right. Our spaces need to be deconstructed or decolonized, if one can use that. Demythologizing of our spaces can be a way in which we say, even if you come from whatever culture, from whatever social background, you will still have a home, you will still belong, you will still be loved, you will still be embraced, you will still experience all the fundamental principles that you would have to experience in the kingdom of God. And that's what the church needs to be all about. And so that will have to go with transforming how we think and understand what church is. And understand that it should be a space that reflects and resembles the kingdom of God, where everyone can be part of it.
I think what comes to mind after that is two things. One, I think of, as South Africa, we say our motto, our slogan is unity in diversity. How we don't say everyone has to be the same. You don't have to fit in to belong. Yeah. You belong within your diversity. Yeah. And that's the first thing. The second thing that comes to mind is the scripture in 1 Corinthians 12:12, where it speaks about we are one body, but many different parts. How we all belong to each other despite our different functions, our different ways of expressing, our different styles of worship. We all belong. And that it isn't, maybe we're not achieving it as it should be at this point, but that there is hope for us, but it is going to require work.
Absolutely. And so as we wrap up today, I think what is important is that we acknowledge that it's going to take a lot of work. It's not going to be easy. It's going to need more conversations like this, but we are definitely called to belong to one another with the premise of our belonging being Jesus Christ. And so we would love to invite you to our Tuesday night conversation, Tuesday Chats. That's the new branding. This will happen on Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Zoom details and everything will be sent out. You should see that just after this. We hope you'll be able to join us. This is a space where we further unpack and we give you an opportunity to even share your thoughts, your heart, and some of the things you're struggling with around this particular topic. Do join us. Otherwise, that's it from us for tonight. Thank you so much. Have you ever left a church service or a Hot Topics conversation wondering how on earth did we get to that stance when the Bible is very clear around the issue in question? An example might be, we might have been speaking about homosexuality, and in your thinking, the Bible is clear, it's black and white, and yet we got to a completely different landing.
We as the Hot Topics team would like to invite you to join us as we unpack how we get from our planning in the week to our Sunday conversation as part of Hot Topics. And so we do that in our Tuesday night chats. Let's tell you a little bit more about how that happens.
Please join us. The best place to find out how we do this is on a Tuesday for our Tuesday night chats.
What you can expect to see as part of our Tuesday night chats is as we look at the Weasley Quadrilateral, a tool we like to use to unpack how scripture, tradition, reason, and experience inform what we believe about a specific topic.
One of the things that we look at is scripture. What does scripture say about the topic in question? We try to understand the true meaning of the scriptures that we're going to reflect on in order to understand God's heart around the topic in question.
And then we also look at tradition. What have we historically, as a church and a corporate body of believers, believed about a specific topic? What are some of the things we've put in stone as doctrines and fundamental beliefs? And how do they inform what we continue to believe as Christians, or what needs to be changed?
We then consider how we can apply our head to get to a point where we feel as though this helps us capture or come close to God's will. For instance, we could consider some research that has been done around the topic in question. We could consider what people have written, what people have said, but we could also consider what science has to say about the topic in question.
And then last but not least, experience. We don't want to neglect what we have personally experienced and we can see is true, but also as a corporate body of Christ, as the church, what is our corporate experience about different issues? And so we'd like to invite you to join us this week for our Tuesday night chats, starting at 7 p.m. on Zoom.
We hope that you will be there. Bring your questions, bring your concerns, because the whole point is we do not have the answers. We're all on a journey together. And what we want to do through these conversations is equip everyone to continue with this journey as an individual, but also as a collective. We hope to see you there.